terms go along with our activity for cell size and diffusion. And so that's what this little symbol right here means. It means and. If you don't know that that means and, or if that's not a comfortable abbreviation for you, then write it out or do whatever works for you. All right, so diffusion. Diffusion is the spreading of particles of a substance within available space along its concentration gradient. So once again, if you're not familiar with the abbreviation, that means within. I just don't want to write it out. You use what works for you. So a concentration gradient means that the substance is moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So diffusion, the spreading of particles of a substance within available space along its concentration gradient, from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. For diffusion, this is a naturally occurring event. There is no energy that's required for this to happen. Also, diffusion is going to occur for each substance along that substance's own concentration gradient. So if we have different stuff, each substance will move along its concentration gradient. Each substance moves along its own gradient. Passive transport. All right, passive transport. So if you're sitting passive in the chair, you just kind of lean back, letting things happen. Passive transport is diffusion across a membrane without energy of input. Passive transport is usually small molecules or nonpolar molecules that can kind of squeak through the membrane in the itty-bitty, teeny, tiny little spaces. When I think of passive transport, I think of looking at the walls in the classroom like a cell membrane. That cell membrane is determining where the cell is. Doors are shut, but there are tiny little cracks underneath the door. So I could take a little sheet of paper and I could slide that little sheet of paper under the door. So that's kind of like what passive transport is within a cell. Itty-bitty molecules like carbon dioxide, water molecules, oxygen molecules, they're able to move through passive transport across those cell membranes. They can get through the little nooks and crannies, get through the little spaces. Passive transport is diffusion across a membrane without energy input. Osmosis is a special term that's for the diffusion of water. So osmosis is specifically for water moving along its concentration gradient. Higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. Osmosis is the diffusion of water. Facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is passive diffusion with help from a transport protein. If I facilitate something, I help that action to occur. In a cell, there are transport proteins that are embedded in the cell wall or in the cell membrane. Those transport proteins are like caves, if you will. They're tunnels. And so when they're open, stuff can move through them freely. So once again, going back to my example like for the classroom, if the walls represent the cell membrane, the doors represent my transport proteins. So I open up the door and things can move freely in and out. I'm not forcing them to move, they're just able to move along their concentration gradient from higher concentration to lower concentration. Facilitated diffusion, passive diffusion with help from transport proteins. Active transport. Active transport is the movement of substances against their concentration gradient. This requires energy, and it's usually the energy comes in the form of pumps that are pumping things against their concentration gradient. So this abbreviation means movement. If you're not familiar with that or that doesn't work for you, then go ahead and spell it out. So for example, I have my doors open, but I have students that don't want to come into class. So I have to go outside and grab the students and literally drag them into the classroom. That's the energy that I'm expending to move something against its concentration gradient. It doesn't want to move from outside the class to inside the class. Remember, a concentration gradient is a substance that's moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So in a cell, this would be a substance like sodium, for example, that's going from a lower concentration of sodium and it's being pumped outside the cell to where there's a higher concentration. It doesn't want to move that way. It has to be forced to move that way, and that's why we require an energy or a pump to push it against its concentration gradient. Active transport is the movement of substances against their concentration gradient. This requires energy. Tonicity. Tonicity is something that you have to talk about in terms of both the cell and its environment, or two items at the same time. So tonicity is the interaction of the cell and its environment, causing the cell to gain or lose water. So that's my AND abbreviation. I'm writing H2O instead of water because I know that's what it means. If those are not familiar with you, then write them out. So tonicity is the interaction of a cell and environment, causing the cell to gain or lose water. And we'll talk more about tonicity and have some examples. But here's a somewhat visual example to talk about tonicity and what's going on. So when we talk about tonicity, there's three different situations: isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. In an isotonic situation, iso is talking about the same. So the cell is isotonic, the solution is isotonic, they have the same tonicity. There's the same amount of solute in the solution and in the cell. In a situation that a cell is involved in, things don't stop. Water is always moving in and out of the cell, but it's going to move in and out in an equal amount. So this is considered a dynamic equilibrium. In this situation, this is hypertonic for the solute on the outside. The cell is hypotonic. Hyper, think of hyper kids, they've got lots of energy. Hypertonic means that there's lots of solute, if this is a salt solution, there's lots of salt in the solution outside the cell. Hypo means low, so hypotonic means there's low solute. The thing is that if this solution is hypertonic, it has lots of solute, but not a lot of free water. So the water doesn't have a lot of freedom to move. For the cell is hypotonic. Hypo, low tonic, low solute. So if there's not a lot of salt, there's a lot of water concentration. Water wants to move along its concentration gradient. It wants to go from a higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. So water is going to move out of the cell. In this situation, the solution that the cell is in is hypotonic. That means there's lots of water and not very much tonic, not very much solute. The cell is hypertonic, so there's lots of solute in the cell. Because water wants to move from where there's lots of concentration of water to where there's a little concentration of water, the water is going to move into the cell. Isotonic, the solution is in dynamic equilibrium with the cell. There's no net movement of water. Water molecules are moving, but they're moving in and out at such a rate that it equals out. Hypotonic means that a solution has low solute. Hypertonic means a solution has high solute. In these situations, the membrane was impermeable to the solute. So this cell had a cell membrane that the solute was not able to move. So that's why only the water moved either in or out of the cell, because the cell membrane was impermeable to the solute. The solute could not change its position.